As we prepare to mark 20 years since 9/11, we're taking a closer look at what that day was like on board Air Force One. On that morning in 2001, then President George W. Bush was visiting an elementary school in Florida to promote his education program. The president was in front of a dozen second graders when he received the news that America was under attack. Once leaving the school, Air Force One quickly took off, where it would fly from one undisclosed location to the next for roughly 9 hours. Along with President Bush, journalist Ann Compton was aboard Air Force One for ABC News on that day, and Ann joins me now. Ann, it is wonderful to see you again. So you were the only television journalist that... It's great to see the old reunion. You were the only television journalist who was there. You were in that classroom when then President Bush's chief of staff whispered into his ear and informed him of the terrible news. What were your very first thoughts in that moment?
We were in such a presidential bubble. We didn't know what was going on. We didn't see the planes crash into the World Trade Centers. But when the White House chief of staff walked into the classroom and leaned down and whispered to the president, it lasted an instant, and then he stepped back. I could tell by the look on the president's face that this was something incredibly grave. We'd heard there'd been a plane crash, and I got Andy Card's, caught his attention. I made the sign of an airplane going down. He put up 2 fingers. What we knew was that there was something catastrophic. What we didn't know is the president had already asked American intelligence, what could al-Qaeda do? How could it hurt Americans on U.S. soil?
And Ann, as everybody else, it's incredible as you recount this, the plane and how much planes were playing in our head on that day. You left that school in Florida, and then you got on a plane, Air Force One, and then you were in the air essentially for 9 hours because the president's security team felt that the safest place for him was to be in the sky. Tell us, what were those hours like? What were the conversations that you had with the president and members of the administration? What was the energy like in that plane?
It was amazing to me, and especially now in hindsight, how little we knew on board that aircraft. You would think you'd have all the communications in the world, but the president was flying at a high altitude. And back in those days, I had a little Motorola clamshell flip phone. I couldn't use that on board the plane. The president had 3 secure lines with which he could reach the ground. But when Air Force One, for its own safety, went to a much higher altitude, those lines deteriorated. He was so frustrated that he couldn't reach Don Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense at the Pentagon. He couldn't reach the security people. We finally had to land at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana because Air Force One had only had enough fuel on it to get back to Washington. The lack of communications was fearsome for the president. And of course, when we get on the plane, we had to have all of our gear checked because the president said we're going back to Washington. As we took off from that first stop, the Pentagon had just been hit. And when the president took off, we found out there was no way we were going back to Washington.
Mm-hmm. You know, you're such a veteran journalist, and you have covered so much of this nation's history in Washington. Were you entirely in journalism mode? Were the other members of the White House entirely in professional mode? Or was there a moment of release of that emotion as we were all experiencing it on 9/11?
Actually, we were in such a bubble. We had so little information from the ground. We could tell by watching on the TV screens that are embedded in the bulkhead wall of Air Force One in each cabin. We could see the towers fall. We could see, but we really didn't have any information. The idea that at that hour of the morning on a weekday, could there have been 20 or 30,000 people in those towers? We couldn't even imagine the destruction. The president argued to go back. This was not something he did in front of us, but to his chief of staff, the president said, the leadership requires you have to be telling people. He couldn't see, people stuck in the towers. We were just so out of the immediate loop that the rest of the country would had. But the president argued to go back because he said he was darned if he was going to give an address to the nation from a hole under the ground in Nebraska. But you know what? That's exactly where he ended up, at a Strategic Air Command base, nuclear bunker. And that's the first time. It was 8 hours later when the president was told, yes, we looked at the manifests, Al-Qaeda operatives were on at very least at that point, the flight that hit the Pentagon. This was a time in which America, first time in my generation, or even my parents' generation, that American civilians were under attack. It was unthinkable.
Unthinkable indeed. I want to ask you